There's something deeply uncomfortable happening inside the WNBA right now, and it has nothing to do with what's happening on the court. It involves one of the most respected figures in women's basketball history suddenly switching sides in a debate she once seemed to be winning. Sue Bird, four-time WNBA champion, Olympic gold medalist, and one of the most influential voices the sport has ever produced, has found herself at the center of a controversy that's exposing cracks in the foundation of women's basketball that a lot of people would rather pretend don't exist, and the name at the middle of all of it, Caitlin Clark. But here's the thing. This story isn't really about Clark at all. It's about a league fighting for its identity, a media war that's getting messier by the day, and a legend who may have just revealed more than she intended to, because when you look closely at what Bird actually said, what she actually did, and how it all unfolded in real time, the picture that emerges is a lot more complicated and a lot more troubling than anyone is admitting. It started, as so many sports controversies do these days, with Stephen A. Smith saying exactly what was on his mind. Now, if you know Stephen A., you know he's never been the type to soften a take just because it's inconvenient. The man built a career on saying the uncomfortable thing out loud. And when the WNBA playoffs rolled around without Caitlin Clark in the picture, he didn't hesitate. He pointed out what the numbers were screaming: viewership was down, ticket sales had softened, and the buzz that had defined the WNBA's most exciting stretch in years had gone noticeably quiet. It wasn't a hit piece, it wasn't an attack. It was a straightforward observation backed by data that anyone paying attention could see. But that's when Sue Bird decided she'd heard enough. Bird's argument was pointed and direct. Stephen A. works for ESPN, and ESPN carries WNBA games. In her view, that created a conflict. She couldn't wrap her head around why someone employed by the very network broadcasting the league would go on air and highlight its declining numbers. She framed it as a loyalty issue, almost a professional obligation. If you're in the building, you don't burn it down. It was a certain kind of sense on the surface, but the moment she said it out loud, something shifted in the conversation, because what Bird was essentially arguing, whether she meant to or not, was that the truth should be filtered based on who signs your paycheck. And Stephen A. was not about to let that stand. His response was immediate and unambiguous. He looked directly into the camera and said what a lot of people were thinking, that being employed by ESPN didn't mean he was obligated to ignore facts, that his job was to speak honestly about the sports world, not to serve as a PR representative for any league, no matter who was writing the check. It was a clean, direct rebuttal. And it reframed the entire argument. Because suddenly, the question wasn't whether the WNBA's numbers were down. Everyone already knew they were. The real question was whether talking about it openly was somehow a betrayal. Stephen A. said no, and a whole lot of people agreed with him. But Bird wasn't done, because while Stephen A. had been the loudest voice in the room, he wasn't alone. Shannon Sharpe had been essentially saying the same things all season, that Caitlin Clark was a phenomenon, that her presence had transformed the league's visibility, and that her absence was going to be felt in a real and measurable way. Sharpe had been consistent about this, vocal about it, and frankly, pretty accurate about it. He and Stephen A. had essentially been aligned on the Clark question from the beginning, both acknowledging her as something genuinely rare in the sports world, the kind of athlete that doesn't just perform well but changes how people relate to a sport entirely. For Bird, having both of them hammering the same narrative was clearly too much. She took aim at Sharpe as well, suggesting that both men had developed a kind of personal investment in being right about Clark, that their ongoing praise of her had become less about genuine analysis and more about defending their own earlier positions. It was an interesting critique, and there was a sliver of logic in it. Sports media personalities do sometimes fall in love with their own takes, but the problem with Bird's argument was that it required ignoring the actual evidence, because whether Stephen A. and Shannon Sharpe were defending their stances or not, the data was backing them up. Viewership numbers confirmed it, ticket prices confirmed it, attendance patterns confirmed it. You can question someone's motives all you want, but when the facts are on their side, the motive argument stops carrying much weight. What made this moment particularly striking was how it reframed the way people saw Bird's position. She had always been viewed as a fierce advocate for the WNBA's growth, someone who understood the business of women's basketball better than almost anyone. But in going after two of Clark's most prominent supporters at the exact moment the league was struggling without her, Bird inadvertently raised a question she probably didn't want raised. Was this really about the WNBA's collective strength, or was it about something else entirely? Here's where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, and where the numbers stop being just numbers and start being a verdict. In the weeks following Caitlin Clark's exit from the playoffs, WNBA ticket prices did something that should have set off alarm bells across the entire organization. They cratered, not slightly, not in the normal ebb and flow of playoff pricing, they dropped to levels that were almost hard to believe for postseason basketball. Tickets at the Target Center in Minnesota for a playoff game. Not a preseason throwaway, we're going for as low as $10.10, that's not a markdown, that's a fire sale. That's a league quietly admitting that without its biggest draw, it cannot fill seats at market rate. Now, on the surface, the arenas still looked reasonably full, and Bird and others were quick to point to that as proof that everything was fine, that the WNBA was thriving, that the seats were occupied, that the product was healthy. She even pointed to venues like the Barclays Center and the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas as evidence that the league was drawing strong crowds independent of Clark, and technically, she wasn't wrong, the bodies were in seats, but the crucial detail that kept getting glossed over was the price those bodies had paid to get there. When you slash ticket prices dramatically to avoid the embarrassment of empty arenas, you haven't solved the demand problem, you've just hidden it. It's the difference between a restaurant that's full because the food is great and a restaurant that's full because they're giving away free appetizers to anyone who walks past. The league knew what it was doing. This wasn't an accident or a pricing miscalculation. Lowering those prices was a deliberate decision made by people who understood that without the Clark effect driving organic demand, they needed to manufacture attendance through affordability. It worked in the narrowest possible sense. The arenas weren't empty, but it set a precedent that the WNBA is going to have to reckon with eventually. You can't sustain a league's growth on discounted tickets and hope that no one notices the gap between what fans will pay to see Clark and what they'll pay to see everyone else. That gap is real, it's significant, and pretending it doesn't exist doesn't make it disappear. Stephen A. noticed it, Shannon Sharpe noticed it, and frankly, anyone who watched closely could see it. The WNBA was running a short-term damage control operation while publicly insisting there was nothing to control, and Sue Bird, one of the smartest people in the sport, was out in front of cameras defending the strategy instead of questioning it. To fully understand why Bird's recent comments felt so jarring to so many people, you have to go back to where she stood on Caitlin Clark not that long ago, because this wasn't always the position Bird held. When Caitlin first exploded onto the national stage during her record-breaking run at Iowa, Bird was among the first prominent figures in women's basketball to acknowledge what was happening. She recognized Clark's magnetism, her rare ability to draw in fans who had never followed women's basketball before, and the kind of crossover appeal that only comes along once in a generation. Bird understood, as someone who had spent her entire career fighting for the WNBA's visibility, what it meant to finally have a player who was capturing mainstream attention at that level. There was genuine warmth in how Bird discussed Clark's potential. During that period, we spoke about the rising tide lifting all boats, the idea that Clark's success would inevitably translate into broader gains for the entire league, that a superstar of Clark's caliber would create new fans, generate new media coverage, and open doors that had previously been closed to women's basketball. It was a generous and accurate read of the situation, and it positioned Bird as someone who understood the bigger picture, even when others were too caught up in comparisons and competition to see it. So, what changed? That's the question that keeps circling back, because the Sue Bird who praised Clark's transformative potential and the Sue Bird who pushed back against Stephen A. Smith for simply reporting on declining ratings after Clark left, those two people are hard to reconcile. The most charitable interpretation is that Bird's concern is genuinely about the league's long-term health, that she worries about the WNBA becoming so identified with one player that it can't stand on its own when that player isn't available. It's a legitimate concern, and Bird has earned the credibility to raise it, but the timing and the manner in which she raised it, by going after the messengers rather than addressing the underlying reality, suggests something more complicated is going on beneath the surface, because this isn't the first time a prominent WNBA voice has pushed back against the Clark wave in ways that seem to undercut the league's own interests. Sheryl Swoopes, another icon of women's basketball, had her own complicated relationship with Clark's rise. Swoopes made comments that generated significant controversy, questioning aspects of Clark's game and her place in the conversation about women's basketball at a level that many felt was disproportionate to anything Clark had actually done wrong. The response was fierce, and Swoopes eventually walked some of it back, but the episode revealed something that's been simmering beneath the surface of the WNBA world. For a while now, there is a faction within and around the league that is genuinely uncomfortable with the scale of attention Clark receives, not because they can point to something she's doing,